Peter, ASPI's new report released this morning, A Stitch in Time, Preserving Peace on Bougainville. Why A Stitch in Time?
Because what we do in this report, Anthony, is to argue the case for proactive early action on the part of Australia and other countries in the region, to see if we can position ourselves to prevent the need for a military intervention should Bougainville revert back to the violence and instability of the type that we saw in the 1990s. So this is not so much a case of talking about a military stabilisation task, so much as what are the things Australia could do to build a stronger foundation for peace in Bougainville, so that when it does go to the referendum, which may well happen sometime after 2015, the referendum on independence or retaining autonomy with Papua New Guinea, that Bougainville will be in a position to do that in a peaceful way, hence the Stitch in Time line.
Okay, and maybe if I could turn to your co-author, Karl, could you explain the window of for the referendum, just the timelines? I think most Australians have assumed that the Bougainville issue was sort of put to bed some years ago. Perhaps you could just take us through what the processes for a referendum would be.
Yeah, the 1997 to 2003 peacekeeping effort was a textbook case in innovative and flexible peacekeeping. That put off the decision on independence to 10 to 15 years after the election of the first Bougainville government. So that was in June 2005. So the window opens June 2015 and closes June 2020.
And do you think that a referendum would come earlier in that period or later? What is your judgment?
Well, most signs are that it would be later, but that is one of the many dangerous signals about at the moment, that there's some disagreement in the signalling by the different sides. Some of the sides are starting in frustration to signal, well, maybe we'll go early. And if one or other of the sides tried to unilaterally have the referendum very early, or indeed delay it beyond 2020, that would be a recipe for real tension.
And Peter, you say in the report that the peace process itself is somewhat adrift. I think you even suggest it could be dangerously adrift. What has led you to that particular finding?
I think there's a couple of factors which have come into play. One is simply that it has been a decade since the peace process was concluded. And really I think we've seen a lot of international attention and Australian attention slip away from the situation on Bougainville. During that period of time there has been an absence of effective development or economic growth. Most of the demographic statistics relating to the island show that it's in a significantly poorer state than the rest of Papua New Guinea even. So there's been not much attention put to creating the foundations for a strong referendum process, a successful referendum process. And from time to time, although Bougainville has been relatively peaceful compared to the war situation which took place in the late 1980s and early 1990s, there have been occasions where violence has broken out on the island, including as recently as sort of 18 months to 2 years ago, where a number of murders took place. And it looked as though factional violence was once again about to sort of become a dominating feature on the island. So this combination of a lack of attention, sort of a failure to develop no real focus on what needs to be done to create a secure and stable referendum environment leads us to think that in fact there may well be the potential for an outbreak of serious violence if what we then see is a sort of a conflicting expectations about what should be the result of the referendum and how that's treated in Port Moresby.
And Karl, following Peter's, the way he's set out those factors, I mean, do you think that we, to some extent, have dropped the ball? I mean, our aid agency's been responsible for the developmental programs of assistance. I mean, have we somewhat taken our eye off the ball in Bougainville?
Well, I think it would be unfair to say that Ausaid dropped the ball. Ausaid doubled its expenditure on Bougainville over the last 3 years, and they've put in, or they're putting in, about 24 advisors or contractors.
Mm-hmm.
The trouble is that an ordinary aid program won't work. It simply can't deliver the enormous economic, social development that's needed in Bougainville to ensure peace. So what we're suggesting is, I guess, a development surge, a real enormous focus on helping out in those areas, and we've had generational change both in Port Moresby, but more importantly on Bougainville, where there's a new generation of young men. They've got a patchy education to draw on, and they haven't seen firsthand just how dreadful the wartime situation was. And the key thing is that they don't have many economic opportunities. The Bougainville economy recovered a bit, but it's still about half the level it was before the conflict started in 1988. So we don't want to be alarmist, but there are some very worrying signals, and Australia really needs to be a leader and with our regional partners start addressing these problems.
So the tripling of aid development assistance that we've suggested would lift the total spend related to Bougainville to a little over $100 million.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can contrast that, if you like, with a cost of a stabilisation operation in East Timor, which was, I think, over $3 billion, Karl, wasn't it, at the end of the...
4.5.
and
and counting, that's the military element only.
And then in the case of the Solomon Islands, the Ramsey cost was in the order of
300
million, with over 100 million still being spent today on Ramsey. So, I mean, $100 million for Bougainville aid is a lot of money. There's no question about that. It does roll off the tongue very, very easily, but it could be a drop in the bucket compared to the potential cost of a military operation if we were forced to go into Bougainville for a stabilisation task some years down the track. And again, that plays to the Stitchin timeline that, you know, if we're smart about this and if we can apply some proactive diplomacy, this may actually be a significant cost-saving measure for Australia in the long run.
And do you think that Ausaid has now, in effect, been folded into the Department of Foreign Affairs to align our development assistance more closely with our foreign policy objectives? Do you think that what you're proposing sits comfortably with that process of dissolving Ausaid into foreign affairs?
Well, it could. I understand that what is actually happening now is that Ausaid officials are being sort of situated in the line and country areas that apply within DFAT. So DFAT officials working on Papua New Guinea will now be joined by Ausaid officials in somewhat greater numbers that will be working with them. And so that does have the potential to align the diplomacy and the aid purposes of Australian policy. I think the best thing to do is really for the government almost to treat Bougainville as a test case of this, as a way of actually demonstrating that this concept of aligning aid and foreign affairs together can work. And really, there is no, better opportunity with a real immediate need than the one that we've outlined in this report.
And Karl, could I just say, ask, following Peter's comment, the $100 million, as he says, rolls off the tongue. What areas of investment would this expenditure be focused on in Bougainville? Are there particular areas you would like to highlight?
Well, our report sets out nine priorities that the Australian government should be following through with, and they include things like policing and working with women and community leaders. The key thing that needs to be done is to have people in there working with the new Bougainville Civil Service, which will stand up from next year, So that needs to be mentored and it needs to be built up. One of the unusual things we suggest, something deeply unfashionable in fact, is that Bougainville needs, the ABG needs budget supplementation. Now that raises a lot of very difficult challenges that will need to be dealt with very carefully. But the fact is, Bougainville needs, the ABG needs money more than it needs good advice to be able to function. And if the Bougainville government can't function, there's no chance of effective independence or meaningful autonomy. So we really firmly believe that is something that government needs to grapple with. And could I just add on Peter's point, talking about aid modalities, there will naturally be anxieties in the development community, and you see them publicised at the moment, that we're shifting a focus off poverty reduction. Now that is obviously an important concern, but we would say that firstly that there's no shortage of poverty in Bougainville. Secondly, that the fear of violent conflict adds a poverty all of its own, a really special type of poverty that deserves to be treated very, very seriously and needs to be prioritised.
And Peter, I suppose for most Australians we would think of our intervention in the Solomon Islands in terms of taking a very proactive line in our neighbourhood. Do you see what you're outlining in your report as Australia being perhaps locked in for over a decade in Bougainville, or do you see this developmental surge as perhaps preempting the need? Is that your point for longer term boots on the ground, as it were?
Yes, I think this is really more a story of a concerted effort around development and stabilisation, capacity building on the island, rather than the model that we saw in the 90s, which was about Australian peace monitors, unarmed, but peace monitors who were there to, if you like, impose order externally. And it seems to me that in the 90s and the 2000s we learnt the lesson of how to do stabilisation using military and police, which has the effect of dampening down instability the instant the force deploys, but doesn't necessarily succeed in building the conditions for stability internally. And I think that's what we now need to look at. In terms of how long is this going to be a commitment from Australia? The point I'd make there is simply to say that there is no exit strategy from our own region. Bougainville and Papua New Guinea both are going to be our neighbours forevermore, and I think they will always require close engagement from Australia to assist as these countries go on their development path. And I don't actually have a problem with that. What I think we need to try to avoid, though, is the sense of the Australian Defence Force being always at call for long-term deployments. The Solomon Islands, case in point, where our forces have been there for almost a decade, and that is hugely expensive. In some ways, it actually stops island communities from taking responsibility for their own stabilisation. I think we need to find better ways to do that than simply sending in the forces, and really that's what our report is trying to come up with, is a sort of a series of concepts about how you can do this before you get to the crisis stage where the troops have to deploy.
And Karl, could I ask you on the role of the private sector? Obviously the reopening of the copper mine in Bougainville would be critical to the long-term economic future of Bougainville, irrespective of whether it's independent or autonomous. Have you got any information on how Bougainville Copper are approaching this particular issue?
I think you're dead right in saying that really the only realistic economic basis for either meaningful autonomy or independence would be large-scale mining. And Bougainville Copper certainly interested in resuming mining. And to some extent, the Bougainvillians, the phrase they use is Bougainville copper is the devil. They know it's a company they're quite comfortable with and used to dealing with. Now, there are a couple of problems here. One is that there are new small-scale international mining companies that are sniffing around who don't actually want to do the mining but want to be able to sell the prospect of mining, and they're causing a bit of instability on the ground. The other thing I guess we have to think about is just even a big company like Bougainville Copper with the enormous power behind that would have to have an amazing appetite for risk to be thinking seriously at the moment. So the ABG, the Autonomous Bougainville Government, is putting together some very innovative mining law for Bougainville, which gives an amazing amount of power to the local landowners. But no company, Bougainville Copper included, are really going to invest the $4 or $5 billion needed to reopen the giant Panguna mine without being pretty confident that there's a solid peace situation in place. We've talked a lot about the cost of a potential mission. Now, we certainly don't want to be alarmist, which could be very unhelpful given the sensitivities around Bougainville. And in some ways, a sort of slide back into conflict is quite unlikely. The thing is that 10 years on from the end of the peacekeeping mission, we're in a much more dangerous place now should violence restart. So when the peacekeepers went in 1997 and the start of 98, it was after a decade of conflict, and it was late period conflict and a ripe moment for peacekeeping. But if we had to go in again with a new generation of young men hopped up for the excitement of combat, this would be a much less permissive environment than the one we went into in 98. And so the potential military costs as well as the economic cost are part of the reason we need to take this so seriously.
And finally, Peter, it's early days, obviously the report's just been issued, but do you have any expectations of how the report and the ideas advanced will be received in Port Moresby?
Well, I think, to be honest, there is a certain suspicion about Australia's role in Bougainville, which is probably always the burden of the former colonial power to have to carry. And really, there is no way that any part of this strategy could succeed unless the government of Papua New Guinea was itself happy with what Australia might propose by way of additional support. So I think the most important thing the government can do would be to start a conversation early with Port Moresby and ultimately with the Bougainville provincial government itself to explain the concept of what this operation might look like, and to seek to develop local support for the plan. I think the other thing that needs to happen, Anthony, is that it's also not conceived of being as just an Australian plan. So we also need to be talking to New Zealand. We should be talking to the UN. We should be talking to a number of other Pacific Island countries to see if they would be prepared to support, as happened in the Peace Monitoring Mission of a decade ago. And I think our attempt really should be an Australian attempt to multilateralise this process in a way that it means it's not just about us, and that it will be very much a partnership with all of the countries and entities that need to be brought to the table.
Well, thank you, Peter and Karl. As Peter said, there's no exit from our neighbourhood, and I think your new report, A Stitch in Time Preserving Peace on Bougainville, will significantly raise awareness and interest in what is potentially a regional problem. So thank you very much for giving us your time today.
Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks, Anthony.